Imagine a bitterly cold morning in November, 1642. A pale fog drifts slowly across the fields west of London, laying a dull veil over the dirt roads soaked by autumn rain. The air is damp and heavy, yet from the distance, the familiar sounds of war begin to rise. The thud of marching boots striking mud, the clatter of metal as armor and long pikes knock against each other, the grinding rumble of heavy gun carriages rolling along the road that leads toward the town of Brentford. If you had stood there that morning, you might have asked the same question that filled London with fear. What would happen if the King's army came within only a few miles of the capital? What if they smashed through the last defensive line and marched straight into London? Could the English Civil War end in its very first year? Sit for a moment and picture yourself standing beside that road, watching lines of soldiers emerge through the mist, preparing to witness one of the most tense mornings ever to unfold at the gates of London. After the Battle of Edgehill, the civil war between the King and Parliament remained undecided. Yet King Charles I understood that time was not on his side. If he could move quickly toward London before Parliament managed to assemble a powerful army, the war might be ended early. For that reason, the Royalist army left Oxford and began advancing eastward along the valley of the River Thames. At the head of this force rode Prince Rupert of the Rhine, a young cavalry commander famous for his speed and bold attacks. Under his command were roughly 4,000 infantry, more than 1,500 cavalry, and several field guns. As the army marched along the Bath Road, Brentford appeared ahead of them, a small but crucial obstacle on the road to London. At that time, Brentford was essentially divided into two settlements. To the west stood Old Brentford, a cluster of houses and small shops beside the main road. To the east lay New Brentford, a larger and more populated district near the bank of the River Thames. Between them ran a narrow stream crossed by a small bridge. Any army that wished to pass through Brentford had to capture Old Brentford first, then cross the bridge into New Brentford. Parliament understood the importance of this position very well, so they stationed a defensive force there under the command of Colonel Denzil Halls. In total, there were only about 1,500 to 2,000 men, most of them London militia. They were not hardened veterans, but they had weapons and some basic training. During the night before the battle, they built makeshift defenses across the road, leading into Old Brentford. Wagons were dragged across the street to block the approach. Barrels, sandbags, and piled earth were stacked into a rough barricade. A few small cannon were placed behind the improvised wall. The soldiers standing in the cold morning air understood their task clearly. They did not need to destroy the Royalist army. They only needed to hold the enemy long enough for London to prepare. On the morning of November 12th, as the first light began to cut through the fog, Royalist units appeared on the road leading toward the town. They advanced in tight infantry formations, long pikes raised upright like a wall of steel. Musketeers marched among the pikemen. Behind them came Rupert's cavalry, their armor dimly reflecting the pale morning light. Rupert had no intention of surrounding the town or searching for another route. He intended to smash through Brentford with a swift and direct assault. Royalist artillery was dragged forward and placed along the main road. When the first cannon fired, the explosion echoed across Old Brentford. The shot slammed into the parliamentarian barricade, splintering wood and throwing dirt into the air. The surrounding wooden houses trembled from the shock. After several opening shots, Rupert ordered the infantry to advance. The Royalist lines moved quickly toward the barricade. They marched through the muddy road, boots sinking into the wet earth. When they came within less than 50 meters of the defenses, Holles gave the order to fire. A volley of muskets erupted behind the barricade. Thick smoke poured out across the road. Men in the front ranks of the Royalist infantry fell, but the lines behind them continued forward. Rupert knew that if his men halted under that fire, they would be destroyed. He immediately ordered a full assault. Royalist infantry surged into the barricade. They climbed over wagons and piles of timber blocking the road. Within minutes, the battle turned into brutal hand-to-hand, fighting in the narrow street. Long pikes thrust forward. Swords struck at men only a few steps away. Muskets fired at such close range that the flash from the muzzle nearly touched the enemy's coat. The parliamentarian soldiers fought fiercely behind their defenses. London militia held their ground, reloading and firing again and again at the men scrambling over the obstacles. But the Royalists had the advantage of numbers and continued pushing fresh units into the fight. New regiments poured into Old Brentford through the side streets, increasing the pressure on the defenders. After nearly an hour of savage combat, the defensive line in Old Brentford began to falter. Some units of London militia started withdrawing across the bridge into New Brentford. The moment the first gaps appeared, Rupert recognized the opportunity. He threw his cavalry forward. The war horses thundered down the narrow road, crashing through the barricades and driving the parliamentarian soldiers from their positions. The defense of Old Brentford finally collapsed. The surviving parliamentarian troops were forced to retreat across the bridge toward the eastern part of the town. Yet, as they crossed the stream, they knew the battle was far from over. On the far side of the bridge, they would have to build another defensive line. And if that line was broken, the road to London would lie completely open before the King's army. When the last parliamentarian units withdrew across the small bridge linking Old Brentford to New Brentford, they were almost running in disorder. Behind them came the shouting of Royalist soldiers pouring through the town they had just captured. Smoke still hung over the rooftops, and scattered gunshots echoed as Rupert's cavalry caught up with stragglers. But the moment they crossed the bridge, Colonel Denzil Holes tried to restore order. He knew that if his men continued fleeing, Brentford would be lost entirely within minutes. He ordered the soldiers to stop and form a new defensive line at the eastern end of the bridge. Wagons were dragged across the narrow street leading into the town. Barrels and cargo crates were overturned and stacked into another makeshift wall. Two small parliamentarian cannon were placed just behind the barricade, with their barrels aimed directly at the bridge. Musketeers took positions along the houses on both sides of the road. Some stood at windows, while others crouched behind low stone walls. The soldiers who had just retreated were still breathing hard. But at Holes's command, they quickly reloaded their powder and prepared to fight again. Across the stream, the Royalists regrouped after the fighting in Old Brentford. Prince Rupert rode along the road, studying the bridge and the new defensive line. He saw the problem immediately. The bridge was too narrow to send large numbers of troops across at once. If the infantry rushed forward without preparation, they would become easy targets for parliamentarian cannon and muskets. So Rupert decided to open the way with artillery. Royalist cannon were dragged into the street, their wheels grinding over stone and mud. When the first gun fired, the blast echoed between the walls of the town. The shot struck the wagon barricade and shattered the wood. Fragments flew into the air. The parliamentarian cannon fired back immediately. Two small guns at the bridge opened fire on the Royalist gunners. One shot exploded in the middle of the road, and several artillerymen fell. Thick smoke quickly spread across the bridge until the entire area disappeared behind a gray curtain of powder smoke. After several rounds of artillery fire, Rupert saw the barricade beginning to weaken. He drew his sword and signaled the infantry to prepare for the assault. Officers carried the order along the ranks. Pikemen and musketeers advanced toward the bridge. When the command was given, they rushed forward in groups, charging across the narrow bridge under heavy fire. Muskets thundered from the parliamentarian line. Royalist soldiers in the front ranks were shot down on the bridge, their bodies blocking the path. Yet more men continued pushing forward from behind. The assault turned the bridge into a stream of soldiers, forcing their way through a storm of gunfire. When the first Royalists reached the far end, they immediately thrust their pikes through the gaps in the barricade. Fierce hand-to-hand combat erupted again. Pikes and swords clashed against the barricade. Royalist soldiers tried to pull the barrels and wagons apart, while parliamentarian defenders struck with musket stocks and pikes to push them back. But Rupert did not rely on the bridge alone. On both sides of it, some Royalist units waded through the shallow stream. The icy water reached their knees, but it allowed them to approach the flanks of the defense. Once these soldiers climbed onto the eastern bank, they rushed into the houses along the street. The fighting quickly spread throughout the town. Muskets fired inside cramped rooms. Doors were kicked open as soldiers stormed inside. On staircases and in dark chambers, men fought with swords only a few steps apart. Smoke and shouting filled the narrow streets. Despite being outnumbered, the parliamentarians held the bridgehead for nearly 2 hours. Trained infantry fired volley after volley at Royalists trying to climb over the barricades. But the pressure kept growing. Rupert continued feeding fresh troops into the fight, regiment after regiment, crossing the bridge or wading through the stream to attack from the flanks. The turning point came when a Royalist cannon shot smashed directly into the main barricade. One wagon blocking the road was blown apart, opening a gap in the defensive line. Royalist soldiers rushed through the opening. The moment the line broke, Rupert acted without hesitation. He ordered the cavalry forward. War horses were driven across the bridge, leaping over bodies and shattered wood. When the Royalist cavalry burst into the main street of New Brentford, the parliamentarian line collapsed in a chain reaction. Exhausted, London militia began to panic. Some threw down their weapons and ran, while others tried to withdraw in formation, but were swept away in the chaos. Hollis tried to rally a few units for resistance, but by then, it was too late. Royalist troops flooded through New Brentford. Rupert's cavalry charged along the road toward London, pursuing the fleeing parliamentarian soldiers. Many ran toward the banks of the River Thames, searching for boats. Some attempted to swim across the freezing water while still wearing armor, but the cold current dragged them down. By early afternoon, Brentford was completely in Royalist hands. The streets of the small town were filled with smoke, shattered houses, and the bodies of soldiers lying across the road. Around 500 parliamentarian troops had been killed, wounded, or captured. The road toward London now seemed almost open before the King's army. Yet this very victory triggered a reaction Rupert and Charles I had never expected. The soldiers fleeing Brentford carried news of the defeat straight into London. And as that news spread through the city, the entire capital began to move. When the battle at Brentford ended in the early afternoon of November 12, 1642, the small town beside the River Thames was nearly destroyed. Smoke drifted above the wooden roofs, while the smell of gunpowder and burning timber hung in the cold evening air. The narrow streets of New Brentford were filled with broken wagons, overturned cargo crates, and the bodies of men who had fallen during hours of brutal fighting. Prince Rupert's Royalist army now controlled the town after completely breaking the parliamentarian defense. For the King's soldiers, it was a clear victory. They had crushed the defending force, captured Brentford, and opened the road toward London. Royalist units began searching the town, gathering prisoners and collecting weapons abandoned on the battlefield. Some cavalry detachments were sent beyond the town to pursue the retreating parliamentarian troops. The surviving soldiers of Parliament ran in disorder along the road, leading east. Some tried to maintain formation as they withdrew, but most simply ran as fast as they could to escape Rupert's cavalry. Many rushed down to the banks of the Thames, searching for any boat that might carry them across. Others plunged into the freezing water, attempting to swim across while still carrying armor and weapons. Many sank beneath the dark November current and never surfaced again. Around 500 parliamentarian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured during the battle and the retreat. Those who survived continued running toward London, carrying the news of defeat. By late afternoon, the first of them reached the western outskirts of the city. They entered London exhausted, covered in mud, many still smelling of gunpowder. Yet the news they carried was more alarming than their wounds. Brentford had fallen, and the King's army was advancing. The news spread through London with astonishing speed. From the docks along the Thames to the crowded market streets, from taverns to trading houses, everyone spoke of the same thing. The Royalist army was only a few miles away. Fear spread quickly. Yet alongside fear came anger. London was the center of Parliament's power, and if the city fell to Charles I, the war might end immediately. The city reacted almost at once. Alarm bells rang throughout London. The London militia, known as the London Trained Bands, were called to arms. Men from across the city left their homes, carrying pikes, muskets, and light armor. Units gathered in squares and at city gates before marching westward. Within less than a day, an enormous force began to form. Not only regular parliamentarian troops, but thousands of London militia prepared to defend their city. Field guns were hauled out from arsenals. Wagons loaded with ammunition and supplies rolled out of the city. A long column of armed men stretched for miles along the roads leading toward Brentford. Meanwhile, at Brentford, the Royalists began receiving troubling reports. Scouts sent toward London returned quickly with news that a large army was advancing out of the city. At first, Rupert believed it was simply the retreating parliamentarian troops reorganizing, but as more reports arrived, the true scale became clear. This was not a few thousand men regrouping. This was London itself marching out to war. On November 13th, 1642, the two armies met on a broad open field known as Turnham Green between Brentford and London. That morning, the fog slowly lifted over the wide fields. From the west, the Royalist army formed its battle line. Infantry stood in the center, with ranks of pikes rising like a forest of steel. Rupert's cavalry took position on both wings, ready to charge if the battle began. To the east, the Parliamentarian army and London militia stretched across the field. Their numbers were far greater than the Royalists. Dense blocks of infantry stood behind lines of field guns. The banners of London fluttered in the cold wind. The army seemed to stretch endlessly across the plain. The two armies could see each other clearly across the open ground. Neither side fired. Officers rode along the ranks, studying the enemy and waiting for orders. Prince Rupert wanted to attack. He believed the Royalist cavalry could break the militia if they struck quickly and hard. But King Charles I saw a different picture. In front of him stood an army nearly twice the size of his own, positioned directly before the gates of London. If a battle began and the Royalists lost, the king's entire army might be destroyed there. For hours, the two armies faced each other in tense silence. At last, Charles I made a cautious decision. He would not attack. As night fell, the Royalist army began withdrawing from its position near Brentford and Turnham Green. They turned and marched back toward Oxford, leaving behind their chance to enter London. Tactically, Brentford had been a Royalist victory. They had defeated the defending force and captured the town. But strategically, the result was the opposite. News of the defeat at Brentford had caused all of London to rise in arms, creating a massive army to defend the city. That reaction destroyed the best opportunity King Charles I had to seize London in the first year of the Civil War. From that moment, the conflict in England would not end quickly. Instead, it would continue for many more years with larger campaigns and bloodier battles yet to come. Brentford, a small town beside the Thames, became the place where the Civil War shifted from a rapid advance into a long and brutal struggle.